The Afro Indigenous experience is a rich and complex one, shaped by the intersection of African and Indigenous cultures, histories, and struggles. Afro Indigenous people are individuals of African descent who also identify as Indigenous, whether through our own ancestry, cultural heritage, or personal connections to Indigenous communities. Many of us are also original born Indigenous to the Americas, or a combination of that. Historically, the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization brought Africans to the Americas, where my ancestors were forced to interact and intermingle with indigenous populations. This led to the development of distinct Afro-Indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. In the United States, for example, the Gullah Geechee people of the Low Country region have a unique Creole culture that blends African, Indigenous, and European influences. Despite our rich cultural heritage, Afro-Indigenous people have faced significant challenges and marginalization. We've also often been erased from historical records, excluded from Indigenous political and cultural movements, and subjected to anti-Black racism within Indigenous communities. The legacy of slavery, forced assimilation, and cultural suppression has also contributed to ongoing struggles with identity, belonging, and cultural preservation. Today, Afro-Indigenous people are fighting to reclaim our heritage and assert our place within Indigenous movements. We are challenging dominant narratives and stereotypes and advocating for greater recognition and inclusion. Through art, literature, music, and activism, we are celebrating our unique experiences and perspectives and working towards a more inclusive and equitable future. Now, here's the truth of history as brown and bronze-skinned American Indians. The Dawes Act of 1887, also known as the Dawes Severalty Act or General Allotment Act, was passed by Congress on February 8, 1887. It was intended to assimilate American Indians into mainstream U.S. society by encouraging us to take up farming and dividing tribal lands into individual plots. However, the act led to the loss of over 90 million acres of tribal land, which was sold to non-native U.S. citizens. The act also led to the creation of the Dawes Roll, a record of individuals with Indian blood. However, the rolls were often falsified, with white men paying $5 to register as Native American in order to reap the benefits that came with having Indian blood. These so-called $5 Indians paid government agents under the table to register on the Dawes Roll, earning fraudulent enrollment in tribes and benefits inherited by generations to come. Some notable Afro-Indigenous individuals include Mardi Gras Indian chiefs who lead Black Indian tribes in New Orleans and celebrate their African and Indigenous heritage through music, dance, and rituals. Cherokee freedmen who are descendants of enslaved Africans and Cherokee people and continue to fight for their rights and recognition within the Cherokee Nation. The Afro-Caribbean Taino Indians have a rich and complex history spanning over 1,000 years. Here's a brief overview. Pre-Columbian era, 1080 to 1492 AD. The Taino people, an indigenous Arawakan-speaking group, inhabited the Caribbean islands, including present-day Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas. Spanish colonization, 1492 through the 1600s. Christopher Columbus' arrival brought European colonization, enslavement, and the transatlantic slave trade. Many Taino people were forced to work in gold mines, leading to a significant decline in population. African enslavement, 1500s through 1800s. Enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean and many were forced to work on plantations alongside the Taino people. Intermarriage and cultural exchange occurred, resulting in a mixed-race population. Marriage and resistance, 1500s through 1800s. Enslaved Africans and Taino people escaped and formed maroon communities, resisting colonial rule and maintaining their cultural heritage. Post-emancipation, 1800s to 1900s. After slavery was abolished, many Afro-Caribbean people continued to face discrimination and marginalization. However, they also maintained and celebrated their cultural heritage, including Taino traditions. Modern era, 1900s to present. Today, Afro-Caribbean people continue to proudly claim their Taino heritage, and efforts are being made to revitalize and preserve Taino culture, language, and traditions. This history is complex, and there is much more to explore. Keep in mind that the Taino people were not a single monolithic group, and their experiences varied across different islands and regions. The Afro Pueblo Indians, also known as the Afro Indigenous people of the Americas, have a rich and complex history that spans over 5 centuries. Here's a brief overview. It's pretty much the same. The pre-Columbian era, the indigenous people inherited the Americas for thousands of years, and they were brought to, many of the African people were also brought to the Americas as slaves, and some escaped or were freed, forming communities with indigenous people. Spanish colonization, same thing. Some of these enslaved people escaped and were freed and formed communities with indigenous people such as the Pueblo people of the Southwest. Now we're getting into the Afro-Pueblo communities, 18th century to 19th century. In New Mexico, for example, Afro-Pueblo communities formed in the 18th century, with people of African descent marrying into Pueblo tribes and adopting their culture. These communities maintain their African roots while also embracing indigenous traditions. Slavery and freedom, 19th century. As the United States expanded, slavery was illegalized and many Afro-Pueblo people were enslaved. After emancipation, some returned to their indigenous communities, while others formed new communities. Cultural preservation and revitalization, 20th to 21st centuries. Today, Afro-Pueblo communities continue to preserve and revitalize their cultural heritage, including their indigenous and African roots. Efforts include language and cultural programs, traditional arts, and political activism to address historical injustices. Here are some notable Afro-Pueblo communities. The Afro-Pueblo people of Mexico, the Garifuna people of Central America and the Caribbean, which are the descendants of African and indigenous people, the peoples of Oklahoma and Texas, descendants of African and indigenous people. Please note that this is a brief overview and there is much more to explore and learn about the history and experiences of Afro-Pueblo Indians. Afro-Brazilians are Brazilian people who are descendants of Africans brought to Brazil as slaves during the Atlantic slave trade. They have a rich cultural heritage and have made significant contributions to Brazilian society, particularly in the areas of music, dance, cuisine, and religion. Here are some key facts about Afro-Brazilians. The population. Afro-Brazilians make up about 8% of Brazil's population, which is approximately 17 million people. Ancestry. Most Afro-Brazilians are descended from West and Central Africans, particularly from Nigeria, Angola, Congo, and Mozambique. Slavery. Africans were brought to Brazil as slaves from the 16th to the 19th centuries, with the majority arriving in the 18th century. Cultural heritage. Afro-Brazilians have preserved many African traditions such as candomblé and Umbanda religions, samba and capoeira, music and dance, and African-influenced cuisine. Discrimination. Despite their significant contributions, Afro-Brazilians face structural racism and discrimination, resulting in disparities in education, employment, and political representation. Identity. Many Afro-Brazilians identify as negro or afrodescente, which means African descendant, while others identify with specific ethnic groups or nationalities. Regions. Afro-Brazilians are concentrated in the northeastern states, particularly in Bahia, Pernambuco and Maranhão, as well as Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Some notable Afro-Brazilians include Zumbi dos Palmares. I'm going to say that again. Zumbi dos Palmares, 17th century leader of the Quilombo dos Palmares, a community of escaped slaves. Luis Gama, 19th century abolitionist and writer. Abdias do Nascimento, 20th century politician and activist. Leia Garcia, actress and activist. Pelé, soccer legend. Overall, Afro-Brazilians have played a significant role in shaping Brazilian culture and society, and their history and experiences continue to influence the country's social and political landscape. The Afro Indigenous experience is a powerful reminder of the complexity and diversity of human identity and culture. By listening to and amplifying the voices of Afro Indigenous people, we can work towards a more just and inclusive society where all individuals can thrive and celebrate their unique heritage. In my book, Embracing Indigenous Wisdom, Traditional Way Teachings for Holistic Wellness by Medicine Woman Cat, I share much more information about our beautiful shared Indigenous culture and communities globally. My goal in writing this book is to preserve Indigenous culture, heritage, and truths for generations to come, and to understand above all that we are one people. Thank you for watching this video or listening to this podcast, however you are consuming it. And my book is available on my Patreon website, which is on my Patreon. My link to this is on my bio, wherever you're reading this or listening to this. And I want to leave you with this quote: "We are related to all. Bliss, blessings, and love and light to you."